A quick word on this week's sponsor, Aura. Aura are dedicated to protecting you and your family from online threats. I received an email a few months ago from a company that I trusted, announcing that they had been involved in a data breach, and my personal information was at risk. This was alarming, and made me aware of the vulnerability of my data. Unfortunately, this is becoming more and more common. The National Public Data Breach in 2024 exposed the personal information of millions of people. If cybercriminals get hold of your personal data, they could target you through identity theft, fraud, and they could even open new credit accounts in your name. Aura will monitor your personal data across billions of data points like the dark web and public court records to alert you about potential identity theft. Every adult on the account, up to 5, gets $1 million in identity theft insurance to cover eligible losses and fees, with a total of up to $5 million in coverage. They provide you with all-in-one protection across multiple devices. They also help remove your personal information from data brokers and people search sites that can sell your information to identity thieves and scammers, and you'll get a VPN service, password manager, and antivirus for your devices. Aura will never sell your data to third parties. I get this all-in-one app at an affordable price. I'm not leaving myself and my family vulnerable to data breaches and brokers, and if you don't want to either, you can go to aura.com/intel to try 2 weeks for free. That will be more than enough time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data is exposed. By the 1st of April 2003, Saddam Hussein's regime was on its last legs. Coalition forces were just 60 miles from downtown Baghdad, and Saddam's iron grip on his nation was collapsing in the face of the invasion. The regular Iraqi military had been shattered in the first days of the campaign, and largely existed only on paper, as most of the resistance against the coalition came from paramilitary groups and local militias. After the war, American interrogators posing as military historians conducted extensive interviews with Saddam Hussein's inner circle and high command, which gives us a unique perspective on the war from the Iraqi point of view. In this video, we will examine the war from the perspective of Saddam Hussein and his high command, exploring in detail their military strategy, assumptions, and the reason for Iraq's military collapse in 2003. The Iraqi military had been badly damaged after its humiliating defeat in Operation Desert Storm in 1991. They had suffered appalling losses, while most of the army's modern equipment was destroyed by superior coalition technology. All 8 of the elite Republican Guard divisions involved in the war were so badly mauled that they needed to be temporarily disbanded. However, there was little time to rebuild the remnants of the Iraqi military. Multiple uprisings against Saddam's regime took place after the end of Desert Storm, and what remained of the regular army were called upon to suppress the revolts. By the end of the war, the uprisings in southern Iraq were defeated, while the Kurdish Peshmerga had been contained to the mountains in the northwest corner of the country. Saddam Hussein held on to power, but recognised that he had barely survived the war and the subsequent revolts. He was keenly aware that internal unrest was the biggest threat to his regime in the immediate aftermath of Desert Storm, and decided to reorient his military to deal with this reality. He dramatically reduced the decision-making ability of his military commanders, and gave more power to his family members and fanatically loyal army officers. His 2 most important moves were designating his youngest son Qusay as commander of the Republican Guard, while Brigadier General al-Tikriti was appointed to command the Special Republican Guard forces responsible for the defense of Baghdad. It cannot be emphasized enough that these promotions were made on the basis of loyalty and not competency. General al-Tikriti was a particularly egregious choice. He was a known drunk and had failed staff college. After the war, when interrogators asked Defense Minister General al-Ta'i about al-Tikriti's ability, the Defense Minister laughed out loud. He told them that al-Tikriti had been appointed because he was a close cousin of Saddam, and he was not clever enough to put a coup together on his own. The rampant nepotism and cronyism severely hampered the Iraqi military's ability to recover from the humiliation of 1991. While Saddam Hussein was busy rewarding his family and the regime's cronies, his generals were struggling to develop a strategy that would prevent another defeat on the scale of Desert Storm. Prior to the First Gulf War, the Iraqi military had been one of the largest and best equipped in the world, but relied upon outdated doctrine that was formulated during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. The 8-year conflict was defined by static warfare, as both sides failed to break through each other's lines. The Iraqi military prepared for Desert Storm using the same defensive tactics they had employed against the Iranians. Poorly trained and equipped border guards held the first line of defense, followed by the regular army. Finally, the Republican Guard acted as the rear echelon, tasked with containing enemy breakthroughs. This strategy had worked during the war with Iran, but led to disaster against the modern militaries of the coalition. Having already achieved overwhelming air superiority, allowing for a 5-week bombing campaign, the coalition ground forces easily smashed through the Iraqi defences in only 5 days. In 1995, Saddam's generals conducted a military review and recommended that Iraq adopt a different strategy to defend against an American invasion. Borrowing from history, they urged the Iraqi dictator to employ a similar strategy to how the Russians defended Moscow against Napoleon and Nazi Germany. The Iraqi army would be arrayed in a defence in depth, with multiple lines of defence emanating from Baghdad. They would trade space for time and attempt to bleed the Americans as they advanced north. There would be no large mechanised divisions held in reserve, as the Iraqi High Command recognised they would be mauled by American and British aircraft the second they started to move south. Instead, the large armoured formations would be broken up and distributed evenly to harden the rest of the army. Much like the Russian winter hampered the French in 1812 and the Germans in 1941, the harsh Arab desert with its sandstorms would ground coalition air power. Critically, the regime was to distribute arms and supplies to local tribes and militias to encourage partisan activities behind the lines. With the relatively recent Vietnam War in mind, they could make the campaign so painful for the United States that the Iraqi government could negotiate a satisfactory end to the war. Although this strategy was militarily sound, the Iraqi president rejected it outright. For Saddam, war with the United States was a distant third on the list of threats to his regime. First was a coup attempt, second was the potential for another conflict with neighbouring Iran. To him, arming the tribes and militias would only result in them turning their weapons on his regime. He ridiculed his generals for their insistence on breaking up the large armoured formations, especially Lieutenant General Rad Majid al-Hamdani, who was the commander of the 2nd Republican Guard Corps and one of Iraq's most capable officers. Saddam accused al-Hamdani of thinking like an American for his interest in military history. He ignored his recommendations. A major reason for Saddam's complacency was his warped view of how the First Gulf War had ended. Having destroyed the bulk of the Iraqi ground forces in the centre and left flank, 150 miles southeast of Baghdad, the coalition turned their advance east towards the Republican Guard in the famous right hook manoeuvre. Norman Schwarzkopf was wary of toppling the Iraqi regime after accomplishing his primary objective of liberating Kuwait, but Saddam held a different view. He convinced himself that Iraqi forces had stopped and defeated the coalition on the Euphrates River, which is why the enemy did not march on Baghdad. Although this was a fatal misreading of the history of the war, Saddam's generals wouldn't dare present any opposing view, less risking imprisonment or execution. As Defense Minister Ahmad told his interrogators after the war, it was not allowed to raise your hand above anyone around you. It was dangerous. If a military leader disappeared, we did not know what had happened, but he was probably dealt with by the security services. Saddam also believed that the United States would be unwilling to suffer casualties in a large-scale war. He mocked the American military's performance in Vietnam, claiming that they had run away after suffering a mere 58,000 deaths. He bragged that his own army had suffered 51,000 casualties in the Battle of Al-Faw against Iran, yet kept fighting. From Saddam's point of view, any attack from the United States would just be another long bombing campaign and maybe small incursions into southern Iraq. Only loyal Ba'athist militias would receive arms from the regime, especially the Fedayeen. Saddam simply could not believe that the coalition would aim for Baghdad, and forbid his generals from developing plans to carry out an insurgency in the case that the country fell. The strategy for defending Iraq would remain the same as it was throughout the 1980s and Desert Storm. After Saddam declared his strategy to be final, he took more steps to coup-proof his regime at the expense of defending his country's borders. Units of the regular army would be stationed far from Baghdad, with most manning the Green Line, the boundary between Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan. Not even the Republican Guard divisions would be allowed in Baghdad. Furthermore, division commanders could not make any decisions without the consent of the Republican Guard's Chief of Staff, a Saddam loyalist, and were forbidden from communicating with other units. The isolation of the army led to a massive decrease in capability, as well as one darkly comedic outcome. According to the book Cobra 2, The Inside Story of the Invasion and Occupation of Iraq, the strictures against contacting, let alone coordinating with, neighbouring units were so severe that the commander of the 1st Republican Guard Corps developed a new use for his reconnaissance units, scouting the location and strength of nearby Iraqi divisions. Following the attacks against the US in 2001, Saddam Hussein slowly came to grasp the danger he was in. In December 2002, he convened a series of top-secret meetings with his inner circle and military high command. He began by making a shocking statement: Iraq did not possess any weapons of mass destruction. The military commanders were stunned at the news. They had assumed the Iraqi regime maintained a hidden stockpile of chemical or biological weapons which could be used against any invader. Saddam had a reason to tell his generals this news. They could not rely upon WMDs to defeat the enemy, and would need to fight to the bitter end with conventional weapons. Rather than galvanizing his military leaders, Saddam's disclosure sent morale plummeting, as his generals knew that they now had little to no chance of stopping the coalition if they invaded. At a later meeting on the 18th of December, Lieutenant General al-Rawi, the Chief of Staff of the Republican Guard, announced that the Iraqi strategy for defending the country would be changed. Once again, the Iraqi professional officers were shocked at this development, considering they had not been consulted beforehand. General al-Hamdani was the sole dissenting voice against the plan, having summoned more bravery than his peers. He warned Qusay Hussein that the plan was full of bad assumptions and lacked any basis in facts. This was to no avail. Qusay shut down the debate by declaring, "The plan was already approved by Saddam, and it was you who would now make it work." Saddam chose the ring plan because it presented the best opportunity for him to preserve his regime, even at the expense of defending his nation. He had already assumed that the coalition plan would be the same as Desert Storm, a long bombing campaign followed by a shallow thrust into southern Iraq. For Saddam and his inner circle, the absolute worst-case scenario they believed would happen would be the establishment of a Shiite enclave in the south of the country. But he felt the regime would survive as long as he held on to the Kirkuk oil fields north of Baghdad. Regardless, whatever plans the Iraqi regime had formulated fell apart once the war began. Contrary to his expectations, the coalition invasion began without a long air campaign, and aimed right for the Iraqi capital. Psychological operations badly hurt Iraqi morale, as unit-specific pamphlets urged soldiers to desert. The commander of the 1st Republican Guard Corps later said, "Even the lowest soldier knew we couldn't stop the Americans." Desertion skyrocketed and left many units combat ineffective. The Al-Nida Republican Guard Division began the war as one of the best equipped units in the Iraqi military, with 13,000 men. Its commander told American interrogators, "By the time we had orders to pull back to Baghdad, I had less than 2,000. By the time we were in position in Baghdad, I had less than 1,000. We had no engagements with the Americans. Every day the desertions increased. Iraqi units were not destroyed by American power, they simply dissolved." Thanks in part to poor intelligence, the initial coalition airstrikes mostly hit empty headquarters, barracks, and other military installations. But the precision attacks had a profound impact on Iraqi soldiers and officers. The ever-present threat of coalition bombing essentially paralysed the Iraqi military, as units tried to remain hidden in pre-prepared positions. Paranoid officers refused to use computers or satellite phones for fear of coalition intelligence tracing their calls, which would inevitably lead to precision munitions heading their way. The Iraqi units which engaged enemy units advancing from Kuwait were either destroyed in place by overwhelming firepower, or forced to disperse back into the civilian population. Despite the unfolding military disaster, Saddam's commanders lied about the results of these battles. One such report from the Southern Region Command on the 21st of March read, "A counter-attack force of the 11th Infantry Division made contact with the enemy and was able to destroy 6 enemy tanks." In reality, the 11th Infantry Division had effectively ceased to exist within the first 24 hours of the start of the campaign. Although most regular army units fled the battlefield, the Saddam Fedayeen fought tenaciously. American units which bypassed large Iraqi cities found themselves under attack from the rear by fanatical Ba'ath Party loyalists, although the Fedayeen did take fearful losses during these engagements. Communications also became a serious problem. Iraqi High Command lost contact with most of its units in the field by the end of March. The US 3rd Infantry Division stood poised to assault the Karbala Gap in the first week of April, while chaos reigned in Baghdad. General Hamdani of the 2nd Republican Guards Corps saw the danger posed by not covering the gap and asked Qusay Hussein for reinforcements. With the fate of Baghdad in the balance, Qusay denied Hamdani's request. This final mistake sealed the regime's fate. On the 4th of April, the 3rd Infantry Division broke through the thin defences covering the Karbala Gap, and, along with the Marine Expeditionary Force, successfully isolated the Iraqi capital. Saddam's regime lost the war because of the gulf in military power, but also in large part due to his hubris, tyrannical behaviour, and lack of common sense in military matters. In a tale as old as time, the overbearing and close-minded dictator only succeeded in sealing his own fate. Thanks again to all our amazing patrons whose support enables us to keep making these videos. Thank you to all our new patrons who joined recently, and a special thanks to our patron of the week, Thor Olsen. Each week we choose our favourite Patreon comments to shout out. This week, Mark says, "Very interesting to see the other point of view. If you'd like to support us, please join our Patreon at patreon.com/the Operations Room and get access to exclusive benefits such as early access to videos completely ad and sponsor free. We would love to have you as part of our community and really appreciate your support.